Welcome back to Untold Reality Daily. Today we take you on a journey through the life of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, tracing the path of a man who rose from the humble streets of Mashhad to become one of Iran's most powerful leaders and eventually faced the consequences of decades of rule. This is the story of his rise, the challenges he faced, and the punishments he endured in his struggle against a system he refused to accept, told in a way that reveals the suspense, tension, and human cost of power. Ali Khamenei was born in 1939 in the holy city of Mashhad, a place known for its religious devotion and the magnificent shrine of Imam Reza. He grew up in a modest family of clerics who valued religious scholarship and piety over wealth or influence. From an early age, Khamenei showed a remarkable curiosity and seriousness, spending hours in study of the Quran, Shia jurisprudence, and philosophy. Even as a boy, he questioned the lessons taught in school, asking difficult questions about justice, power, and the responsibilities of the rulers. His inquisitive nature made him both admired by teachers and occasionally wary of the local clergy, who were cautious of students who dared to challenge traditional interpretations. These early experiences instilled in him a mindset that would define his life, a belief that authority must be challenged when it deviates from what he considered righteous, and that resilience in the face of punishment was the measure of true conviction. By the time he reached adolescence, Iran was under the rule of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whose policies of modernization clashed sharply with traditional religious structures. The Shah's rapid reforms, including land redistribution, secular education, and the expansion of Western cultural influence, created widespread unrest among clerics and conservative communities. Khamenei witnessed the arrests, beatings, and exile of religious leaders who opposed these reforms. He observed ordinary citizens being harassed for minor acts of protest, and he began to understand the weight of power and the cost of resistance. These formative years instilled in him a strong sense of duty to defend Iran's Islamic identity, and he quietly began seeking ways to participate in organized opposition. In the late 1950s, Khamenei moved to Qom, the spiritual heart of Shia scholarship, to continue his studies. Qom was more than a place of learning. It was a hub of political activism. Young clerics, students, and intellectuals debated not only theology, but also the direction of the nation. Here, Khamenei met other students who shared his vision of a society governed by Islamic principles rather than secular authority. He attended lectures, delivered sermons, and quietly organized networks to oppose the Shah. Participation in these movements carried enormous risk. The Shah's secret police, known as Savak, maintained strict surveillance, and dissenters often faced imprisonment, torture, or even death. Khamenei was arrested multiple times during this period. He endured harsh interrogations, physical beatings, and long nights in solitary confinement. Each punishment tested his resolve, but rather than deterring him, these experiences strengthened his commitment to the cause. He learned to survive, to calculate risk, and to navigate a landscape where loyalty and secrecy were essential for survival. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, Khamenei became increasingly involved in anti-Shah activities. He helped organize protests, distributed writings critical of the monarchy, and coordinated with senior clerics to build support for an Islamic revolution. He observed the methods used by the Shah to suppress opposition, informants within mosques, infiltration of student groups, and public trials designed to intimidate citizens. Khamenei internalized these lessons. He understood that survival required discipline, strategic alliances, and unwavering focus. His reputation as a disciplined, loyal, and resilient cleric grew, and senior leaders began to trust him with sensitive tasks. The punishments he endured became a badge of honor, a symbol of his dedication, and a training ground for the strategic thinking that would later define his leadership. Khamenei's association with Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was exiled to Iraq during much of the 1960s and 70s, was a turning point. Khomeini had become the figurehead of resistance against the Shah, articulating a vision of an Islamic state that resonated with millions of Iranians. Khamenei acted as a liaison between underground movements inside Iran and the exiled leadership, delivering messages, coordinating demonstrations, and supporting propaganda efforts. These activities were perilous. Colleagues were captured or executed, and networks were infiltrated. Khamenei narrowly escaped arrest several times, using quick thinking and secrecy to avoid the fate of those less fortunate. Each close call reinforced the precariousness of the struggle and taught him the importance of patience, discretion, and strategic planning. By the late 1970s, public unrest against the Shah intensified. Students, clerics, and ordinary citizens participated in demonstrations across the country. Khamenei, though still relatively young, was at the center of these revolutionary activities. He delivered speeches, organized support for protests, and helped maintain communication between different factions of the movement. Despite the constant danger, he remained committed to the vision of an Islamic government. Convinced that the suffering he endured and witnessed under the Shah was necessary to achieve a greater purpose. His early life of discipline, study, and punishment had prepared him for this moment. Every risk he took was informed by decades of experience in enduring oppression and navigating political intrigue. The revolution reached its climax in February 1979 when the Shah fled Iran and Khomeini returned from exile. Khamenei, having survived countless arrests and punishments, found himself in a position of influence. His loyalty to Khomeini, experience in the underground networks, and ability to endure hardship positioned him as one of the key figures of the newly forming Islamic Republic. The nation was filled with optimism, but it was also fragile. Political factions vied for control, and the future of the revolution was uncertain. Khamenei's next challenge was no longer surviving under oppression. It was consolidating power, managing opposition, and ensuring that the vision of an Islamic state he had fought for did not collapse under internal division or external pressure. Even as the revolutionary government was established, Khamenei faced immediate threats. Secular groups, leftist movements, and rival clerics challenged the new order. The early years of the Islamic Republic were marked by political purges, imprisonment, and trials of those perceived as threats to the revolution. Khamenei played a role in these events, using both strategy and influence to protect the core leadership while ensuring that dissent was contained. These actions, while controversial, reflected a continuation of the lessons he had learned under the Shah. Authority must be defended, loyalty must be cultivated, and punishment is a necessary tool in maintaining order. By the end of Part 1, Khamenei had survived a life filled with danger, endured repeated punishment, and established himself as a rising figure within the new Islamic Republic. His early life and anti-Shah activism demonstrated resilience, intelligence, and a willingness to accept personal suffering in pursuit of a larger goal. The story ahead will explore how he transitioned from a revolutionary figure to supreme leader, how he consolidated power, and the crises that would eventually mark the later years of his life. It is a tale of ambition, ideology, and the human cost of both rising to power and resisting those who dared oppose him. In this part of our documentary on Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, we follow his journey from a revolutionary cleric to the supreme leader of Iran. This is the story of his climb to absolute authority, the consolidation of power, and the crucial decisions that shaped the Islamic Republic while also sowing the seeds of future challenges. The rise of Khamenei was not inevitable. It was forged through perseverance, strategy, and the consequences of his unwavering commitment to ideology, often at great personal cost. Following the success of the Islamic Revolution in February 1979, Iran was in a state of transition. The Shah had fled, leaving a vacuum in leadership that the returning Ayatollah Khomeini would fill. Khamenei, having proved his loyalty and skill during the revolution, quickly rose through the ranks of the emerging political structure. He was recognized not only for his ideological commitment, but also for his ability to navigate the complex networks of revolutionary factions. These networks included former leftist activists, traditional clerics, and young revolutionaries, many of whom had competing visions for the new Iran. Khamenei's skill lay in his ability to balance alliances, reward loyalty, and neutralize potential threats without provoking open confrontation. His experience of survival under the Shah's regime had taught him the importance of patience, discretion, and calculated influence. In the early years of the Islamic Republic, Khamenei assumed multiple leadership roles. He was appointed to the Assembly of Experts, the body responsible for selecting and supervising the supreme leader, and later to the presidency of Iran in the early 1980s. During this period, he confronted both domestic and international crises. The Iran-Iraq War, which had begun in 1980, tested his political and strategic capabilities. The conflict was devastating. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians died. Cities were destroyed, and the national economy was severely strained. Khamenei's leadership involved not only rallying the population for the war effort, but also ensuring that internal dissent did not undermine the state. His methods included strategic purges, monitoring of political rivals, and strict enforcement of ideological conformity. Each punishment or threat neutralized, reinforced his authority, and demonstrated his readiness to endure personal and political risk for the stability of the nation. Khamenei's rise was also characterized by his mastery of ideological narrative. He emphasized that Iran's sovereignty and Islamic identity were under constant threat from Western powers, particularly the United States and its allies. By framing domestic challenges as extensions of foreign pressure, he was able to consolidate support among citizens who feared external interference. This narrative also justified harsh measures against opposition groups, portraying dissent as not merely political disagreement, but betrayal of the nation and true faith. Khamenei's ability to intertwine ideology with practical governance was a key factor in his rise, creating loyalty that was both moral and strategic. The death of Ayatollah Khomeini in June 1989 marked the defining moment of Khamenei's ascent. The position of supreme leader required not only religious authority, but also political skill, the ability to control military and intelligence apparatus, and the capacity to command loyalty across a fractured political landscape. Khamenei, now in his early 50s, was selected to succeed Khomeini, a choice that surprised some who believed senior clerics with more scholarly prestige would assume the role. His appointment was possible because of his long-standing loyalty, experience in revolutionary networks, and ability to navigate factional rivalries. With the supreme leadership, Khamenei achieved the apex of power in Iran, with ultimate authority over all branches of government, the military, and key economic institutions. As supreme leader, Khamenei faced immediate challenges. Iran was recovering from the Iran-Iraq War, which had left the economy devastated and the population traumatized. Political factions jostled for influence, including reformist clerics, secular groups, and nationalist parties. Khamenei's approach combined both rewards and punishments, Loyal allies were appointed to strategic positions, dissenters were monitored, and opposition figures were removed through legal or political means. The punishments, he observed, under the Shah's rule became a blueprint for maintaining control in peacetime. Strategic use of authority allowed him to neutralize threats without destabilizing the country. Khomeini also extended his influence through control of financial resources. By overseeing foundations, companies, and investments, he created a network that funded loyalists, religious institutions, and social projects aligned with his vision. This economic control ensured that political rivals lacked the resources to mount effective opposition and reinforced the perception of the supreme leader as the ultimate arbiter of power. By linking financial influence with ideological loyalty, Khomeini created a system in which dissent carried practical consequences and obedience provided tangible benefits. Throughout the 90s, Khomeini continued to consolidate his authority while facing emerging challenges. Reformist movements, particularly in urban centers, called for political openness, social freedoms, and greater engagement with the international community. Khomeini responded with a combination of suppression and ideological framing, portraying reformist ideas as threats to the revolution and to Iran's Islamic identity. Students, journalists, and politicians who resisted were closely monitored, detained, or removed from positions of influence. These measures demonstrated that Khomeini's rise was not merely the accumulation of titles, but the careful exercise of authority to ensure that his vision remained unchallenged. Khomeini's regional and international influence also grew during this period. Iran pursued alliances with allied movements in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, projecting power beyond its borders. These alliances were strategic, designed to counter Western influence and expand Iran's regional presence. Khomeini personally oversaw these relationships, ensuring loyalty and ideological alignment among partners. This external engagement reinforced his domestic authority, as it allowed him to present Iran as a sovereign and powerful nation under the guidance of a resolute supreme leader. By the early 21st century, Khomeini had reached the peak of his power. He controlled Iran's government, military, economy, and ideology. Opposition was limited, dissent was dangerous, and loyalty was rewarded. Yet even at this height, cracks began to appear. A new generation of Iranians, connected to the global community through education and technology, began questioning the limitations imposed by his regime. Economic hardships caused by international sanctions, corruption, and mismanagement fueled dissatisfaction. Khomeini faced protests, criticism, and political pressure that challenged the image of an unassailable leader. These emerging threats would later form the foundation for the decline phase of his story, demonstrating that no rise, however calculated, is free from the possibility of fall. It is clear that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's ascent to the position of supreme leader was the result of decades of dedication, endurance of punishment, and strategic intelligence. His rise was marked by loyalty to revolutionary ideals, mastery of ideological narrative, and control of both domestic and international levers of power. The story ahead will explore how the pressures of leadership, internal opposition, and global scrutiny contributed to the challenges, crises, and eventual decline that defined the later years of his life, highlighting the human vulnerabilities behind the facade of supreme authority. In this part of our documentary on Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, we explore the period after his rise to power, where he consolidated authority, faced growing domestic challenges, and navigated the early signs of decline. This is a story of how supreme power brought not only control and influence, but also the burdens of expectation, dissent, and unforeseen crises. Even the most powerful leaders must contend with the limits of human endurance, political complexity, and the consequences of decisions made under pressure. By the mid-1990s, Khamenei had firmly established himself as supreme leader. He controlled the government, judiciary, military, and intelligence networks. Loyalists occupied key positions across the country, and Iran's ideological narrative was tightly managed through state institutions and media. Khamenei's financial empire, estimated to be worth approximately $95 billion US, further reinforced his power. By controlling wealth and resources, he ensured that support for his leadership remained practical as well as ideological. Those who opposed him faced economic marginalization, limited influence, or direct political consequences, echoing the punishments he himself had endured under the Shah. However, even at the height of power, challenges began to emerge. Economic difficulties, partly caused by international sanctions and mismanagement, led to growing dissatisfaction among ordinary citizens. Reformist politicians and activists called for greater transparency, political freedom, and engagement with the outside world. Khamenei viewed these movements as threats to the revolutionary ideals he had fought to establish, and he responded with a combination of suppression and narrative framing. Protests were quelled, journalists were detained, and dissenting voices were labeled as agents of foreign powers seeking to destabilize the nation. Khamenei's approach was methodical, contained threats, reinforced loyalty, and maintained the ideological legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. The rise of the Green Movement in 2009 marked one of the most significant domestic crises of Khamenei's tenure. Following contested presidential elections, millions of Iranians took to the streets demanding reform. The protests were particularly prominent in Tehran and other major cities, and social media played a key role in organizing demonstrators and spreading information. Khamenei's response was swift and strategic. Security forces were deployed, opposition leaders were imprisoned or silenced, and state media portrayed the movement as influenced by foreign governments seeking to undermine Iran's sovereignty. This episode revealed that Khamenei's authority, while formidable, was not unassailable. Popular unrest, fueled by dissatisfaction and a desire for reform, could challenge even the most entrenched leadership. Throughout this period, Khamenei maintained strict control over cultural and educational institutions. Schools and universities emphasized loyalty to the supreme leader and adherence to Islamic principles. Media outlets and publications were closely monitored to ensure conformity with state ideology. Public campaigns reinforced nationalistic and religious narratives, portraying Khamenei as the protector of Iran's sovereignty and Islamic values. This control allowed him to shape public perception and maintain influence over generations, but it also revealed a tension. The more tightly information and ideology were managed, the more resentment grew among those who sought freedom of expression and political participation. Internationally, Khamenei gained increasing scrutiny and pressure. Western governments criticized Iran's nuclear program, human rights practices, and regional interventions. Khamenei framed these criticisms as attacks on Iran's sovereignty and Islamic identity, strengthening domestic support by presenting foreign pressure as a continuation of historical struggles against colonial and global powers. His alliances with groups in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria extended Iran's influence, projecting power regionally while reinforcing the narrative of resistance. These foreign engagements, however, also carried risks. Miscalculations could provoke retaliation, economic sanctions could worsen domestic hardship, and unpopular military involvement could fuel dissent. The complexity of maintaining both domestic control and regional influence began to expose the limits of even Khamenei's formidable authority. As Khamenei aged into the 21st century, health concerns, generational shifts, and technological change added new challenges. The emergence of internet access, satellite media, and social networks allowed dissenters to organize in ways previously impossible. Citizens became more aware of economic inequality, corruption, and political repression. Khamenei's response involved a combination of increased surveillance, selective censorship, and continued ideological messaging. Yet, cracks in public confidence became more visible. While he remained powerful, it was increasingly clear that his authority depended on both fear and loyalty, and that sustaining control over a modern, connected society was an ever-growing challenge. Political infighting within Iran also intensified. Factions emerged among the clergy, military, and reformist politicians, each seeking influence over government policies. Khamenei faced pressure from conservative hardliners who wanted stricter enforcement of ideological conformity, as well as moderates who sought to modernize and adapt to international realities. Balancing these factions required careful calculation, negotiation, and sometimes harsh measures to prevent any one group from threatening his position. The use of punishment, removal from office, imprisonment, and public censure remained a key tool, reflecting the lessons of his youth under the Shah, but the sheer complexity of governance in later years made every decision riskier. The economic dimension of Khamenei's rule also contributed to the early signs of decline. While his financial empire provided immense influence, the broader economy struggled under sanctions, mismanagement, and systemic corruption. Ordinary citizens experienced hardship, unemployment, and inflation, fueling resentment against the government. Social unrest increased, and the legitimacy of the supreme leader, which rested in part on the promise of stability and prosperity, faced new pressures. Khamenei's inability to fully address these challenges revealed a vulnerability that contrasted sharply with the unshakable authority he once projected. By the end of this part, it becomes clear that even as Khamenei consolidated power and maintained dominance over Iran's political, economic, and ideological spheres, the seeds of decline were already present. Popular dissatisfaction, generational change, international pressure, and internal factionalism all foreshadowed the challenges that would define the later years of his life. The story ahead will explore the full scope of these challenges, the crises that ultimately shaped his legacy, and the circumstances of his death, providing a complete view of the rise, peak, and fall of one of Iran's most influential figures. Welcome back to Untold Reality Daily. In this final chapter of our documentary on Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, we examine the last years of his life, the culmination of decades of power, and the challenges that marked the decline of a once unassailable leader. This is the story of how authority, influence, and ideological dominance eventually faced the limits of human capacity, social change, and historical circumstance, and how Khamenei's life concluded, leaving a complex and enduring legacy. By the late 20-teens, Khamenei had been supreme leader for more than 3 decades. His health, though closely guarded in public, became a subject of speculation among Iranians and international observers alike. Decades of the immense stress of ruling, coupled with natural aging, imposed physical and cognitive strains. Khamenei continued to maintain his daily schedule, addressing clerics, military officials, and state institutions, but there were growing signs that the weight of authority was taking its toll. At this stage, the cracks in his control became more visible. Social media amplified dissatisfaction, and protests erupted sporadically in urban centers. Citizens protested economic hardship, inflation, and political repression, and these demonstrations were increasingly difficult to contain entirely. Khamenei's Traditional methods of punishment, detentions, surveillance, and censorship, remained in use but became less effective in suppressing an increasingly connected population. Internal political divisions also intensified during his later years. Conservative hardliners demanded stricter ideological enforcement, while reformists continued advocating for political openness and social freedoms. Generational shifts meant that younger clerics and politicians sometimes challenged established hierarchies, creating subtle but persistent pressures on Khamenei's authority. Navigating these factions required delicate balance. He employed loyalty tests, appointments, and the strategic use of financial resources to manage factions. Yet the rising awareness of inequality, corruption, and external pressures made absolute control increasingly tenuous. Even long-standing allies grew cautious, aware that the state of affairs might shift rapidly after the eventual passing of Khamenei. Khamenei's international position, once a pillar of his domestic authority, also faced mounting challenges. Sanctions imposed on Iran over its nuclear program, regional interventions, and human rights issues increasingly strained the economy and complicated governance. Alliances in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq continued to demand attention and resources, stretching the capacity of both Iran's economy and administrative apparatus. Khamenei's attempts to frame these challenges as external threats succeeded in rallying some support, but the cumulative pressure exposed vulnerabilities. While his ideological narrative remained consistent, public perception shifted subtly, reflecting frustration with living conditions and limited opportunities in everyday life. By the mid-2020s, Khamenei's health had visibly declined. Reports of hospitalizations, reduced public appearances, and delegation of responsibilities to trusted aides signaled that the era of his active leadership was drawing to a close. Political factions, aware of the coming transition, began positioning themselves for influence over the succession process. This period highlighted the fragile nature of concentrated power. Despite his lifetime of strategic planning, endurance of punishment, and suppression of dissent, the realities of human mortality and societal change meant that even Khamenei could not fully control the future. His life became a study in the limits of authority, showing how decades of rule can be challenged by the inevitability of aging and historical forces. The final years of Khamenei's life were marked by reflection, consolidation, and preparation for succession. Loyalists and family members were appointed to secure continuity, while the ideological foundations of his rule were emphasized in public messaging. Even in decline, he remained a symbol of Iran's revolutionary ideals, a figure whose life had been shaped by resistance, punishment, and the pursuit of a vision for his nation. Yet the very factors that had allowed him to rise, centralized control, reliance on repression, and ideological rigidity, also contributed to the challenges faced by his successors. The systems he had built were deeply influential but required constant maintenance, illustrating the paradox of concentrated power. It elevates a leader, but also creates dependency that is difficult to sustain beyond their personal authority. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei passed away in the late 2020s, leaving a nation at a crossroads. His death marked the end of an era, the conclusion of a life that spanned the upheaval of the Shah's rule, the triumph of the Islamic Revolution, the challenges of war, the consolidation of power, and the slow erosion of absolute control. In the aftermath, historians, political analysts, and citizens debated his legacy. Supporters lauded him as a steadfast guardian of Iran's sovereignty, a man who endured persecution and maintained ideological continuity in the face of formidable challenges. Critics described him as authoritarian, responsible for political repression, economic inequality, and social limitations. The duality of his legacy reflects the complexity of a life spent balancing ideology, survival, and authority. Khamenei's story is instructive for understanding the dynamics of power, the human cost of leadership, and the interplay between ideology and pragmatism. His early experiences under the Shah shaped a leader capable of enduring punishment and navigating adversity, while his later years revealed the inherent vulnerabilities of centralized control in a changing world. His rise and fall illustrate that power is not only about accumulation, but also about management, resilience, and adaptation to shifting social, political, and generational forces. The consequences of resisting him during his life, as well as the pressures he faced, underscore the high stakes of leadership in volatile contexts. As we conclude this documentary, it is clear that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's life offers lessons on the resilience of human ambition, the complexities of governance, and the inexorable passage of time. His rise, consolidation, and eventual decline provide a full arc of power, illustrating both the rewards and burdens of authority. While his influence on Iran and the world was profound, his death also reminds us that all leaders, regardless of strength or ideology, are ultimately bound by the limits of mortality and historical circumstance. Thank you for watching Untold Reality Daily. We hope this documentary has helped you understand the life, rise, and decline of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Please tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city and country, so we can see how far this story has reached. If you have not already done so, kindly like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue producing documentaries that uncover untold histories, explore complex figures, and bring to life the narratives that shaped our world. Stay curious, stay informed, and join us as we continue exploring the untold realities of history.